Death has a smell, blood tastes good, and whoever survives a war carries scars that the eyes cannot see. Imagine surviving the hell of World War II, where 60 million souls were taken, and finally returning home believing the nightmare is over. But what if I told you that for this soldier, the real blow didn't come from the Nazi bullets or the bombs exploding around him? The real blow awaited him at home, in the innocent words of a child that would change everything. The year was 1945. The Boer. Streets were decorated to welcome the heroes returning from Europe. Flags waved. Women awaited the return of their husbands. Children dreamed of the embrace of parents they only knew from faded photographs. Among them was John Sullivan, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and lived to tell about it. His hands shook no longer from the rifle he had carried for 3 years, but from the anxiety of finally embracing the wife he left behind, with the promise of returning. Every step towards his old home was like stepping into a minefield, not for fear of explosions, but for the terror of the unknown that awaited him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air. His wife's letters, which previously arrived religiously every week, had become scarce in recent months. The last one, received almost 6 months ago, contained vague, distant words, as if written by a stranger. The military uniform that protected him in the trenches now felt too heavy, suffocating. The medals on his chest, which symbolized bravery and honor, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what his heart sensed. The same streets that saw him leave now witnessed his return, but the man returning was not the same man who left. War transforms. War devours souls and spits back only shells of what were once men. When he finally saw the White House with the yellow fence that he built with his own hands, his heart stopped. The door slowly opened. John expected to see the face of the woman who lived in his dreams during the cold nights in the trenches of Europe. The woman who was his safe haven, his reason to survive. But it wasn't Sarah who showed up. A child, no more than 5 years old, with golden hair and piercing blue eyes, stood in the doorway. Eyes that seemed to pierce his soul like no bayonet ever could. Time froze in that instant. The small hand held the door tightly, as if keeping a secret too big for her small body to bear. "Are you the man in the photograph?" asked the child, pointing inside the house where there was possibly a portrait of him in military uniform. The simple question landed like a grenade in his chest. John swallowed hard. "Yes, it's me," he replied with a choked voice. And then came the bomb. The words that no amount of military training could have prepared him to hear. Words that would make the horrors of Normandy seem like a simple training exercise. With the cruel innocence that only children possess, she said 6 words. 6 words that shook the foundations of everything he believed. 6 words that made the brave soldier who faced the Nazi war machine crumble inside like a bombed building. The blood drained from his face. His legs, which had marched hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory, were now barely able to support him. The hands that had held tightly to a rifle were now shaking uncontrollably. John had survived grenades, machine guns, and extreme hunger, but those simple words from a child were a weapon more lethal than any. Military technology. In his mind, flashes of the war mixed with memories of Sarah, the goodbye kisses at the port, the exchanged promises, the scented letters that gradually became rare, distant and cold. Now everything made sense, a terrible, devastating sense. Are you prepared to find out what this child said? Because once you know, there will be no going back. Just like for this soldier, whose life changed forever in that moment, some truths are like time bombs waiting to explode. In every corner of the world, there are people who feel like their stories are never told. Stories of sacrifice, of silent pain, of invisible battles. When you like this video and subscribe to the channel, you're not just supporting content. You're joining a community that honors those history has forgotten. You're saying, I also believe these stories deserve to be heard. Join us now, leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because some truths need to be preserved, and we can only achieve this together. Do you know what it's like to look death in the eye every day and survive just for the dream of returning home? What if, when you finally returned, you discovered that some truths are more devastating than any battlefield? Think with me for a moment. You spent years in filthy trenches, seeing friends being torn apart by bombs, smelling burning flesh, hearing screams that will never leave your memory. All of this for a single thought: returning home, to the arms of the one you love. That hope was his shield, his armor against the horror. It was what kept his heart beating when everything around him was death. This is the story of a man who believed the worst was over, until a child said 6 words that changed everything. Imagine carrying the weight of an entire war on your shoulders. Imagine surviving hell on earth, where every second could be your last, where every breath was a victory against death. This man not only survived, he preserved his humanity amidst the chaos. He kept the faded photograph of his wife in his chest pocket, kissing the image before each battle, promising himself that he would return to her, no matter the cost. On each cold night, as other soldiers succumbed to despair, he fanned the flame of hope. I counted the days, the hours. I imagined what it would be like to open that wooden door, smell the scent of home, hug those I had left behind. For him, this mental image was sacred. It was his safe haven amid the storm of steel and blood that surrounded him on all sides. What would you do if that image, that dream that kept you alive, suddenly shattered before your eyes? How would you react when you discovered that while you were fighting for your country, for your life, for your future, something irreparable was happening to the life you left behind? That while you bled on distant battlefields, your own history was being rewritten without you. The pain of a physical injury has a limit. The human body can only register a certain amount of suffering before it shuts down, before consciousness retreats into darkness. But the pain of the soul, this has no limits. There's no mercy. It does not offer the luxury of unconsciousness. It is an abyss that opens and continues to deepen without ever finding the bottom. This soldier physically returned from the war, but part of him never returned. And it wasn't the part that many imagine. It wasn't the nightmares about bombs exploding. It wasn't the tremors in your hands when you heard loud noises. It was something much deeper that remained in the trenches. It was his ability to trust, to believe in the future, to feel security. And all because of 6 words, 6 simple words spoken by innocent lips. Words that hit his heart with more precision than any enemy bullet ever could. Words that made time freeze, that turned his world to ashes faster than any bombing. Can you imagine what those words were? Can you feel the weight they carried? If you have ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet, if you have ever had the sensation that your life changed completely in a single instant, then perhaps you can understand a fraction of what this man experienced in that moment. After 3 years in the hell of war, he dreamed of the moment when he would breathe the air of his city again, but no one warned him that when you leave, not only do you change, everything changes. 3 years, 1,095 days away from home, every morning, waking up with the taste of dirt in your mouth, every night sleeping with the echo of gunshots in your ears. Time passes differently in war. A day can seem like an eternity when you are lying in the mud hoping the enemy doesn't find you. And 3 years is a lifetime. For John, the way home seemed unreal, as if you were walking in a dream. The colors were brighter than he remembered, the loudest sounds, the most intense smells. Everything seemed exaggerated after so long living in a world reduced to ash, smoke, and blood. Was he the one who had changed? Or was it the world that no longer recognized him? The same streets now seemed strange. The same faces now carried secrets. And the silence. The silence said more than any explosion he had heard. It was a heavy silence filled with something he couldn't name, but he could feel, like an animal feels the approach of a storm. There was something about the way people looked at him, quickly looking away when their eyes met. There was something about the way conversation stopped when he approached. Have you ever felt like you no longer belong in a place you once called home? John felt it with every step. The uniform he once wore with pride now seemed to mark him, separating him from the rest. The medals on his chest, each representing moments of terror overcome, of lives saved, of extreme courage, now seemed to weigh tons. He wanted to rip them off. I wanted to scream that I wasn't a hero, that he was just a man trying to get home. As he walked through the familiar streets that now seemed to belong to another world, flashes of the war invaded his mind. The smell of cordite, the deafening noise of machine guns, the scream of your best friend being hit, the feeling of blood running between his fingers as he tried futilely to stop the wound. Memories that infiltrated the present reality, blurring the lines between then and now. The city continued its life during his absence. Babies were born, people died, weddings took place, divorces too. Life didn't wait for him. Why would I wait? The world does not stop because of a war. It doesn't stop because of a soldier. It doesn't stop because of promises made before departure, sealed with desperate kisses and words full of hope. John had sent letters, so many letters, At first, the answers came quickly, full of love, plans for the future, small, everyday stories that he collected like treasures, reading and rereading until the words became part of him. Then the letters started to get shorter, more sparse, until finally, for the last 6 months, silence. A silence that he justified with the chaos of war, with communication difficulties, with 1,000 reasons that did not include the truth that his heart was already beginning to suspect. When the last letter arrived months ago, something was different. The words were there, the same words as always. I miss you. I'm waiting for you. Come back to me. But there was something between the lines. Something about the spacing of the letters. In the pressure of the pen on the paper, it was as if someone else had written those words. Someone wearing the mask of the woman he loved. As he approached his street, the premonition grew. The knot in his stomach tightened. The pulse accelerated. Cold sweat ran down his back despite the mild day. It was the same feeling I had before going into combat. The same instinct that had saved his life so many times. And now that instinct screamed, warned, begged him to turn around to get away from there before discovering what awaited him. What do you think happened in this soldier's life while he was away? What change could be so devastating that it would make a man who faced death every day afraid to enter his own home? Share your theory in the comments. With each step towards your home, your heart accelerated. Have you ever felt that devastating intuition, that feeling that whispers in your ear that something is wrong, even when everything seems normal? It's like a sixth sense that alerts us to invisible dangers, threats not yet manifest. The ancients called this clairvoyance. Modern people call it intuition. Soldiers call it survival instinct. He had survived the war by trusting those instincts. And now they screamed. The house was different, not in the walls or the windows, but in the energy, as if a secret was waiting for him. The little white house with the yellow fence was exactly as he had left it. The front garden, which Sarah loved so much, was still well looked after. The flowers he had planted before leaving were still blooming, like a promise fulfilled. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly the same, and that was precisely what seemed wrong. John remembered the day he was ordered to leave, how Sarah had cried in his arms, how she had made desperate promises. I'll wait for you no matter how long it takes. I'll be here when you get back. Words spoken with such conviction that he never doubted. Itu, that last hug before boarding the train, she had put something in his pocket, a small photo of her smiling with a message written on the back, to remind you what you're fighting for. During the worst moments at the front, when fear threatened to consume him, when exhaustion made it impossible to take another step, it was in that photo that he found strength, in the frozen smile of that woman who promised to wait for him, in the warmth of that promise that crossed oceans and borders to reach him in the cold and damp trenches where death was a constant companion. Now, standing in front of the house he dreamed of seeing again, he felt something strange in the air, an absence, a void that shouldn't exist. The front window, where Sarah used to watch the street, awaiting his arrival even when he had just left for work, was empty. No sign of her, no movement behind the lace curtains she had sewn herself. His steps slowed as he approached the door. Every inch felt like an eternity. His body, which bore scars from battles most people only knew about through newspaper headlines, now felt too heavy, as if some invisible force was trying to stop him from reaching that door, to discover what was behind it. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. Normally there would be children playing, neighbors chatting over their fences, the peaceful routine of an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon. But today, there was only silence. A respectful silence, or a complicit silence? John couldn't make it out, but he could feel the stares coming from quickly closed windows, from quickly hidden faces. As he climbed the 3 steps that led to the porch, memories flooded his mind. The day he carried Sarah in his arms through this very door, after his wedding. The laughs shared on summer nights sitting on this very porch, the plans for the future, the dreams of a family, of children running around this same garden, dreams interrupted by a war that wasn't his, by a duty that ripped him from the arms of the one he loved. On the last step he stopped. He took a deep breath. He adjusted his uniform, wrinkled from the long journey. He ran his hand through his hair, now grayer than he remembered. He tried to prepare himself for the reunion he had imagined so much, for the arms that would wrap around him, for the kiss that would erase 3 years of nightmares, for the comfort of finally being home. But nothing could prepare him for what happened next. When he raised his hand to knock on the door, it slowly opened. Not with the impulse of someone rushing eagerly to welcome you, not with the rush of a wife who finally sees her husband after years of separation, but slowly, hesitantly, as if whoever was on the other side was afraid of what they would find. And it wasn't Sarah who was there. It wasn't the face he had kissed 1,000 times in his dreams during cold nights in the trenches. It wasn't the eyes that had looked at him with so much love when he said goodbye. It wasn't the lips that had promised to wait for him, no matter how long it took. It was a child, a small child, no more than 5 years old, with golden hair and intensely blue eyes. Eyes that seemed to see through him, that seemed to know secrets he didn't yet know. Eyes that studied him with an innocent curiosity, but that carried a disproportionate weight for someone so young. Then it happened. The door slowly opened. And it wasn't his wife. It wasn't a family member. It was a child. Time froze in that instant. The world around him seemed to disappear, reducing to just that small figure framed by the door that he had painted with his own hands before leaving. A child whose face he had never seen before. A child whose existence made no sense in his home, in his world, in his story. A child of approximately 5 years old, eyes that seemed to know him, even if he had never seen them before. Eyes that carried a truth that could rebuild or completely destroy the life he believed he left behind. It was the eyes that hit him first. Blues, intensely blue, like Sarah's, with the same depth, the same ability to see beyond the surface. But there was something more to them, something Sarah never had, a disconcerting familiarity that he couldn't identify, but that reverberated somewhere deep within his being. The small face watched him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. There was no fear there, just a kind of expectation, as if the child was expecting something from him, something he didn't know he could offer, something he didn't even understand. "Who are you?" the childish voice asked, breaking the silence that seemed to last for an eternity. A simple question, direct, a question that hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Who was he? A soldier returning from war, a husband returning to his wife, a stranger standing at the door of a house he no longer recognized as his own? The words stuck in his throat. His brain seemed incapable of formulating a coherent response. How to explain his existence, his presence there, to someone who clearly didn't know him, for someone who shouldn't be there, to someone whose presence turned everything he believed to be true into a cruel illusion. I used to live here," he finally managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Hoarse, weak, the voice of a man on the edge of a cliff, trying desperately not to fall. "I'm looking for Sarah. Sarah Sullivan." The small blue eyes widened slightly upon hearing the name. There was a flash of recognition there, an instant of understanding that made John's stomach tighten into a painful knot. The child knew Sarah. Of course he knew. He was at his house. But how? Why? "Mommy's at work," the answer came, simple and devastating, destroying John's world with the ruthless innocence only a child possesses. Mommy. The word echoed in his mind like a gunshot. Mommy. Sarah. Your Sarah. Mother of this child who would have been born at when? Approximately 5 years ago, shortly after his departure for war. His knees threatened to give out. His vision darkened at the edges, as if he was about to faint. But he stood his ground. Military training, discipline forged in years of war, kept him standing when all he wanted to do was collapse. "And your father?" The question escaped before he could stop it, before he could consider whether he really wanted to know the answer. The child tilted his head slightly, studying him with disconcerting intensity, as if you were trying to solve a puzzle, as if something in John awakened a distant memory, a half-erased image. "Dad is at war," he finally replied, with a confidence that left no room for doubt. "Mom says he's a hero, that he's fighting for the good guys, that one day he'll come back to us." Every word was like a blade piercing his heart. Each syllable rewrote his story, transforming what he believed to be a betrayal into something much more complex, much more devastating in its beauty and tragedy. "Dad is at war, a hero, fighting for the good guys," words Sarah would have said to explain her absence, words that kept his memory alive not just for her, but for this little being who looked at him now with such familiar eyes. It was then that realization hit him with the force of a bomb. The blue eyes, the shape of the chin, the way the child tilted his head slightly when observing him, exactly as he did when he was thoughtful. This was not Another man's son. This was his flesh and blood, your son. A son he never knew existed. A son conceived in the final nights before his departure, born while he fought in distant lands, raised with stories of a hero father who would one day return. And now he was here. He had returned. But not for the life he left behind, but for an entirely new life. A life that included not only the wife he loved so much, but a child, your son. A child who didn't recognize him, who looked at him like a stranger. At the door, because that's exactly what he was. A stranger, a materialized ghost of stories told before bed. If you could say just one thing to this father meeting his son for the first time in 5 years, what would it be? Comment below in the comments. Time stopped when their eyes met. Have you ever wondered how some decisions are made in seconds but define decades? He was in that moment now. A moment suspended between a past that no longer existed and a future that had never been imagined. Moment of impossible choice. Reveal yourself now? Take a step back? How do you introduce yourself to a child who is both familiar and strange at the same time? A child who carries your blood but not your memory. In his mind, he rehearsed 1,000 possibilities in a split second. "I'm your father" sounded too strong, too impactful for a first date. A shock that could traumatize, confuse. "I'm a family friend" sounded like a lie, a denial of a sacred bond that, although unknown, already existed. And in the midst of this whirlwind of thoughts, as the silence stretched beyond comfort, the child took a small step back, suddenly aware of the strangeness of the situation. "Do you know my father?" The question came filled with hope, a pure, crystalline hope that only children can express, a hope that weighed on John's shoulders more than any backpack carried across European battlefields. Meet your father? He was your father. But how to explain this? How can we explain the lost years, the first unheard words, the unwitnessed first steps? How can we explain that while this child was growing up, learning to walk, to talk, to discover the world, he was in filthy trenches, fighting for his life, completely oblivious to the existence of this little being? The child looked at him directly, without fear, without hesitation, and said something that no amount of military training could have prepared him to hear, something that made his entire world freeze and then crumble in slow motion. "Mommy cries when she looks at Dad's picture. She thinks I don't see it, but I do. She says he looks like you." The words hit John like a physical blow. Sarah crying alone when no one was looking. Sarah keeping his memory, his presence alive, even without knowing if he would return. Sarah raising the son they had both raised alone, carrying the double weight of longing and responsibility. And this child, so small but so perceptive, capturing the pain that adults try to hide, understanding at his level the complexity of emotions that color the adult world. "Your mother," John began, but his voice trailed off. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control, trying to find the right words, the words that wouldn't traumatize, that wouldn't confuse, that wouldn't destroy the image built over years. "Your mother is a very strong woman, very brave." The child's eyes lit up. "That's what Dad always says in his letters, that Mom is the strongest and bravest woman he knows." The excitement in his voice was palpable, an established connection, a small point of contact between two worlds that were beginning to approach each other. Letters? John didn't understand right away. He had sent letters to Sarah, of course, countless. But specific letters to this child? Impossible. He did not know of its existence, and then he understood. Sarah had written letters on his behalf, letters from a distant father to a son who grew up without his physical presence, letters that kept alive the bond that distance and ignorance threatened to destroy, letters that created a relationship, a story, a connection between two beings who had never met. Sarah's love was manifested not only in the creation of this son, but in the preservation of his father's image, assuring that when and if John returned, he would find not a stranger but someone who already knew him through words written with love and hope. The moral dilemma he now faced was monumental. Reveal yourself immediately, running the risk of overloading this little mind with too much information, too many emotions, or wait, let Sarah set the stage, explain the situation, create a smooth path to revelation. Each option carried consequences. Each option had the potential to define the future course of not just his life, but the life of this child, who now looked at him with growing curiosity. As he struggled with these impossible questions, the child took a small step forward, a step that reduced the physical distance but symbolically represented much more, A step towards the unknown, the father he only knew through stories and letters. A step full of courage that John, with all his military training and war experience, deeply envied at that moment. "Do you want to come in?" The simple, direct, honest question. "Mum will be here soon. She always arrives when the sun starts to turn orange." The innocent offer of hospitality, of belonging, hit John on a level he hadn't expected. Here was this child, inviting him into his own home, a house he had built with his own hands, but which now seemed to belong to a different world, a different life. The decision he made now would not only affect him, but everyone involved in this complex story of love, loss, absence, and perhaps redemption. Sarah needed to know he had returned before any revelations were made. It felt fair. It felt right. She who had carried the weight of raising a child alone, of keeping alive the memory of a man who might never return, deserved the chance to participate in this pivotal moment. Inside his mind, a battle fiercer than any war raged. Flashes of the woman he loved, letters that have gone unanswered in recent months, a silence he attributed to distance, but which now took on a new devastating meaning. For years, as he crawled through muddy trenches, as he watched men beside him get torn apart by bombs, as he tasted fear in his mouth with each uncertain dawn, he clung to a single truth: Sarah would be waiting. This truth was his shield, his armor against the despair that consumed so many other soldiers. Now, in front of his son, this truth was revealed to be more complex, more profound, more painful, and at the same time more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. Sarah had waited, yes, but not just expected. She had created an entire life in her absence, a life that included him, even when he was not physically present, a life that preserved his memory, his legacy, his love, the silence of the last. Letters took on a new meaning. It wasn't abandonment, it wasn't forgetfulness, it was protection. Protection for him, fighting a brutal war where any distraction could mean death, and protection for this child, who was growing up with the intact image of a hero father, not the brutal reality of a man facing unspeakable horrors every day. Between the soldier who swore to protect his homeland and the man who promised to love his family, which one would respond to that child? Which truth would he choose to face? The soldier knew about discipline, order, and following protocols. The soldier could retreat, wait for Sarah, plan his next move with the same calculated precision that kept him alive in enemy territory. But the father who had just awakened within him with overwhelming strength, he wanted to kneel down, hug this child, make up for every lost second, every unshared moment. "Can I wait for your mother with you?" John finally asked, opting for a compromise. Neither complete revelation nor total withdrawal. A small step towards an unknown territory, but one that called to him with a magnetic force that was impossible to resist. The boy nodded, opening the door wider. A silent invitation to enter not just the house, but the life Sarah had built during her absence. A life that held space for him, even when his return was just a distant possibility, not a certainty. As he crossed the threshold, John felt as if he were entering a parallel world. The furniture was the same but rearranged. The smell was familiar but with new elements. Photos on the walls told a story he had not been a part of. Christmas, birthdays, first steps, precious, irretrievable moments, recorded in images that now seemed to belong to another person, another life. And in the center of the room, framed in a golden picture frame he had never seen before, was a photograph of him, the same one he had left with Sarah before leaving. His face was young, confident, innocent, looking toward a future he couldn't predict. Next door, a more recent photo of the child. The similarity was undeniable. The same eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, the same way of tilting your head. "Mommy says I have your eyes," the boy commented, following John's gaze to the photographs. "She says I can see things other people don't, like you in war." The simplicity of the observation hit John with disproportionate force. This boy didn't just carry his genes, his physical appearance. He carried his idea, a version of him built through stories, photos, letters, a version perhaps more heroic, simpler, purer than the reality of the man who now returned, carrying visible and invisible scars from a war that had forever transformed his vision of the world and of himself. How to reconcile these two versions, the hero father of Sarah's stories and the broken man returning from war? How to live up to the silent expectations of this small being who carried his blood but not his real memory. How? To be worthy of the preserved love cultivated by Sarah during years of uncertainty and loneliness. The child moved around the room with the confidence of someone who knows every inch, every hiding place, every story behind every object. This was his home, his territory. John was the outsider here, even though he was the one who had chosen every floorboard, every nail in the walls, every detail thought out for the future he imagined with Sarah before the war took everything from him. "Do you want to see my room?" The question came naturally, as it would from any child eager to show their little world to a visitor. An innocent invitation that carried monumental weight. This child's room had probably been planned as the guest room, or maybe the office John always wanted to build. Now it was his son's sanctuary, a space that contained your treasures, your dreams, your discoveries, a space John had never seen before. "Of course," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Every step through the house was like walking through an emotional minefield. Each object, each corner, revealed a part of the life that had been lost, of the life that Sarah had built on her own, of the life that this boy had lived without her presence. The room was exactly what a 5-year-old boy raised by Sarah would look like, organized but not rigid, colorful but not chaotic. On the walls, children's drawings of stick figures, a family, mother, son, and a taller, more distant figure, father. The visual representation of an absence that shaped this child's existence since his first breath. And on the table next to the bed, something that made John's heart skip a beat. A small wooden letter holder, filled to the brim with envelopes worn from frequent handling. The letters Sarah had written in her name, the words through which this boy had known his father, the improvised bridge over the abyss of absence. 3 options presented themselves: deny reality and move on as if nothing had happened, confront the truth and all its painful consequences, or run away again, this time not from bullets, but from feelings that no man is prepared to process. Each path led to a different future. Each choice meant a different kind of pain, a different kind of healing, a different kind of man he would become from this moment on. The first option seemed the easiest on the surface. Back off. Wait for Sarah to arrive. Let her mediate this impossible meeting. Let her prepare the ground. Explain the situation with the right words at the right time. It was the rational option, the option that would minimize trauma, that would follow a gradual, organized process, the option that the soldier in him would approve of, with his discipline, his order, his respect for authority and hierarchy. But there was a fundamental problem with this choice. He was already here. I had already crossed the threshold. He was already in his son's room, looking at letters he never wrote, but which carried his name, his imagined presence. The meeting had already taken place, even if his true identity remained veiled. To retreat now would be another form of absence. It would be perpetuating, even if for a few more hours, the distance that had already stolen precious years. The second option was terrifying in its vulnerability. Reveal yourself now. Tell the truth. "I am your father." 4 words that would change everything. 4 words that carried the weight of years of absence, of lost moments, of a relationship built on stories and not on shared experiences. 4 words that could overload this little mind with too much information, too many emotions, too many changes all at once. Plus, there was Sarah to consider. Would it be fair to her to make this decision unilaterally? She who had carried the weight of motherhood alone, who had constructed this careful narrative to preserve the image of the absent father, who had kept alive the hope of a return that many would consider unlikely, didn't. She deserved to participate in this crucial moment, this revelation that would rewrite family history once again. The third option was the most shameful, the most unthinkable, but it still insisted on presenting itself in the dark corners of his consciousness. To escape, turn your back on this house, on this son, on Sarah, disappear again, avoiding the complexity, the responsibility, the magnitude of what it meant to return not just to a wife, but to an entire family, a family that had learned to function without his physical presence, a family he might no longer be needed for. This option was the ultimate cowardice, the antithesis of everything he believed he represented as a soldier, as a man. But the war had shown that all men, faced with enough terror, with enough pain, were capable of acts they would never have believed possible. And there was a specific kind of terror in this moment, the terror of not measuring up, of not knowing how to be a father, of not being the hero this boy believed he was. What would you do? Because on the battlefield you follow orders. But in front of that door with that child, he needed to make a decision that no superior could order. In war, choices are often binary, brutal in their simplicity: life or death, forward or backward, shoot or save. Here the choices were infinitely more complex, more nuanced, more fraught with consequences that would span decades. While John struggled with these impossible possibilities, the boy had approached the bed. He pulled an object from under his pillow that John recognized immediately, a small carved wooden box that he had made for Sarah before he left, a box that should contain letters, photographs, small souvenirs of your relationship, a box he had entrusted to her as a container for shared memories. "Mummy said this is yours." The boy held out the box in his small hands. "She lets me look at them sometimes when I really miss Dad. She says they're special treasures." John accepted the box. With shaking hands, the familiar weight, the texture of the wood beneath your fingers, the soft sound of the lid opening. Inside, the letters he had sent from the front, worn from being read so much, folded and unfolded by anxious hands. The wedding ring he had left with Sarah for her to keep until his return, a small handkerchief stained with blood, his blood, from the day he left, when he accidentally cut his finger while packing his last suitcase. Sarah had kept even that, and at the bottom of the box, something he didn't immediately recognize, a little baby shoe, white, delicate, preserved as the most precious of relics, your child's first shoe, a son he didn't know existed while fighting in distant lands, a son who now watched him with eyes identical to his own, waiting for a reaction, for a sign, for some indication that this stranger understood the importance of what he had just shared. It was at this moment that John realized that there weren't really three choices. That never had been. That from the moment he saw that child at the door, there was only one possible path, a path that would require greater courage than any battle had ever required, a path that would mean not just accepting the truth, but embracing it with all its complexity, all its pain, all its unexpected beauty. With a deliberate movement, he knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy, eyes that were reflections of his own, eyes that studied him now with an intensity that seemed beyond his years, eyes that, without knowing it, searched this stranger's face for traces of the father they only knew through stories and photographs. What words would you choose for this impossible moment? Tell me in the comments what your first sentence would be for a child you never met, but who grew up believing in you. Physical war ends with peace treaties, but the wars within us, those are decided by choices we make when no one is looking. And now, kneeling before his son, John faced the most important battle of his life, a battle without an instruction manual, without prior training, without trench companions to share the weight of the decision. How many men had gone through this before him? How many soldiers had returned to find that life had gone on without them, that time had brought changes that no letter could fully capture? How many had faced the abyss between the life they left and the life they found when they returned? The Second World War had separated millions of families. I had created millions of stories like yours, some with happy endings, others with scars that would never completely heal. "Can I tell you a secret?" John finally said, his voice firmer now, finding strength in some deep place that even he didn't know existed. The boy nodded, his blue eyes fixed on John's, an instinctive trust that transcended the fact that they were technically strangers to each other. A trust based on something deeper than shared memories, based on blood, on connection, on something that not even war could erase. "A long time ago, before you were born, I made a promise. I promised that I would come home no matter what. I promised that nothing would stop me from returning to the people I love." John paused, weighing each word. Each syllable now carried the weight of a history being rewritten, of a future being redesigned in real time. "I kept that promise today. It took longer than I expected, much longer, but promises are important, especially promises made by parents. Understanding was not instantaneous. It wasn't like the movies with dramatic music and a theatrical reveal. It was gradual. It was a small frown. It was an almost imperceptible tilt of the head. It was a series of connections being made in a young but incredibly perceptive mind. The stranger who knew the house, that there was a box of treasures kept by my mother, that spoke of promises and returns. "You," the boy began, his voice barely a whisper. The word hung in the air, charged with potential, with possibility, with a truth too great to be fully articulated, a truth that would change everything. John nodded slightly, allowing the moment to unfold in the natural rhythm of childlike understanding, not forcing, not rushing, respecting the enormous cognitive and emotional adjustment that was taking place before their eyes, the moment when an idea, a concept, a distant figure from nightly stories transformed into a real man, flesh and blood, kneeling in front of him. The front door opened before any more words could be exchanged, the familiar sound of keys, of footsteps, of a bag being placed on the table. Sarah was at home. The time was over for deliberation, for careful planning. Reality was about to collide in all its glory and terror. "Thomas, who are you talking to?" Her voice came from the entrance, exactly as John remembered. A little more tired, perhaps, a little more mature, but unmistakably Sarah, the woman who had populated his dreams during years of forced separation, the woman who had single-handedly raised the son they had both fathered, the woman who had kept his memory alive when it would have been easier to leave him behind, as so many others had done. The boy, Thomas, his name was Thomas, looked at John with an expression that was impossible to decipher, a mix of confusion, excitement, fear, hope, so many emotions for such a small heart to process. "Mommy," he called, without taking his eyes off John's face. "There's a man here. He says he made a promise." Sarah's steps quickened down the hallway. John stood up slowly, his heart beating so hard it felt like it could burst through his ribs. This was the moment he had dreamed of for countless nights in the trenches, the reunion with the woman he loved. But now there was an added dimension, a complexity that none of his dreams had anticipated. When she appeared at the bedroom door, time seemed to freeze. She was different, slimmer, a few strands of premature grey in hair that he remembered as completely black, expression lines that weren't there before, marks of a life lived alone, of silent battles fought on the home front while he fought on distant fields. The shock on his face was palpable, the disbelief, as if seeing a ghost. In a way, that was exactly it, the ghost of a love she had preserved through stories, through letters, through photographs, carefully shown to a son who had never met his father. John, his name on her lips, sounded like a prayer, a question, a hope so fragile that it could shatter at the slightest whiff of doubt. "I'm back," was all he could say. Two syllables that carried the weight of years of absence, of danger, of uncertainty. Two syllables that were both an end and a beginning, the end of a wait that seemed endless, the beginning of a new journey, even more complex than the previous one. Thomas looked from one to the other, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand the electricity in the air, the tension, the emotion that carried each unspoken word, each restrained gesture. His little eyes, John's eyes, widened in sudden understanding. "Is that him?" The childish question cut through the charged silence. "Is that Daddy?" This soldier faced his toughest battle not with weapons, but with the courage to face the truth. "And you? What invisible battles are you fighting now? What truths are you avoiding confronting?" There are moments in life that define who we are, moments that demand from us courage that we didn't even know we possessed, moments that separate the man we would like to be from the man we really are. When Sarah and Thomas finally faced the truth before them, something bigger than any world war transformed in that room. Some battles leave visible scars, wounds that everyone can see and understand. Others mark the soul in ways that no medal can represent. This soldier faced both, and his greatest victory was not surviving the trenches of Europe, but finding the courage to rebuild what seemed irretrievably lost. The truth has this power. It destroys illusions, yes, but it creates space for something authentic to blossom from the ashes. Every second you dedicated to this story was not just to learn the fate of a soldier, but to recognize universal truths that exist in each of us. You felt the impact because you recognized part of your own journey in those words. This recognition creates an invisible connection, a bridge between hearts that have already faced their own silent wars. Leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. Each interaction expands this community of people who understand that our deepest stories deserve to be told and heard. The battles we face are rarely the ones we prepare for. As this soldier discovered, the most transformative challenges come at the most unexpected times, testing not our physical strength, but our ability to accept, adapt, and rebuild. What was the moment when you needed to find courage that you didn't even know you had? Share in the comments. Your story could be exactly the light someone needs to find today. There is another story like this waiting for you, a story that goes beyond the trenches, beyond 6 words, beyond everything you imagine about courage and redemption. Click on the next video now and see. Some truths are too powerful to be told just once.